A lot has been going on today. So welcome to this latest event in our Fantastic Friday program. Some of you I know have been here for all the sessions during the day, but for those of you who have just come in, what is Fantastic Friday? No, we are not going to secretly unveil Super Blue. Sorry to say, our budget is not that big. But Fantastic Friday is a special program we're doing today at the festival that focuses on speculative fiction, fantasy, folklore, basically contemporary writing from the Caribbean and elsewhere that works within that genre and uses it to tell stories about our past, our present, and our many possible futures. So we've had some extraordinary writers on the stage here today so far. And this particular session I'm really excited about because we're going to be hearing from 4 authors who have not yet finished their first book, but who are working on a first book that works within this genre, in some way, dealing with speculative fiction, fantasy, reworking traditional folklore. And these are writers we're excited about, and we can't wait for their books to be published. And so this is a kind of a preview, so that in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, some writers are slow. Whenever the books come out, you'll be able to say, the first time I heard them was at Bocas. So when you're doing a selfie, in 5 years' time with a famous author, you'll be like, yeah, I heard you at Bocas. And they'll be very impressed that you were in from the earlies. So you want to hear from the writers, not from me. So let me plunge right into it. We've got 4 writers we're going to hear from this afternoon. So what I'm going to do is, so that I don't keep jumping up and down on stage like a trained monkey, I'm going to introduce them all in one go, all at the beginning. They're going to read in alphabetical order. So once I introduce them, they will just come up one at a time, and you'll hear from their work. They will tell you as much or as little as they think you need to know about their stories. I have read all of their work. I'm excited about it, and I know you're going to enjoy this session. So the writer Franco and Vindhar Suraj. Let me give you brief bios of each of them so you know who you're hearing from. So Dixie-Ann Belle is a freelance writer, editor, proofreader, regular contributor to UE Today, fiction writer. She's the first writer we're going to hear from this afternoon. The second one will be Jolanda Charles, a fiction writer who was longlisted for the 2024 Bocas Breakthrough Fellowship, and she's currently working on her first speculative fiction novel. Then we're going to hear from Janine Mendes-Franco, writer and media producer, and she's the regional editor for Global Voices, the Caribbean editor for Global Voices, an organization I used to work for, so I should remember the name of it, right, Janine? And Janine is maybe best known as a television producer, television and film producer, but she is now working on a children's fantasy novel, which I think is going to be an exciting one for younger readers very soon. And finally, the last person we're going to hear from this afternoon is Vindhar Suraj, who is currently the president, right, of the Writers Union of Trinidad and Tobago. But also just a writer who is interested in, as he says, representing the Caribbean experience by drawing on techniques of magical realism to create familiar yet unique perspectives. And I've also read a little bit of his novel in progress, and it is eyebrow raiser. So with no further ado, please give a round of applause to the writers. We'll begin with Dixie-Ann, and let's hear from their work.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to read an excerpt from my unfinished work, The Sisterhood. It's not the beginning, so just a little introduction. My character, Jackie, she drives a taxi. One night, she's attacked by a guy she knows. During the struggle, she fights back and accidentally, unfortunately, kills him. But while she's doing the struggle, she has these visions of, or what she thinks are visions of this woman in white goading her on, waving a cutlass, not helping, but being there, and she doesn't know why that happened. She's just completely confused. And so the story my excerpt begins here. The door of Jackie's cell groaned rather than rattled. It was very rusty, she had noticed at some time in the night. She had noticed other things too, as she lay awake for hours on the narrow bed, perfectly still, frozen, afraid to touch anything near her. The noise of the police station came harshly to her from the office. The bed creaked whenever she couldn't help but move. A dank, nauseating scent rose from the old sheets and the toilet she could not bring herself to use. Jackie was afraid to move, even when the door opened, because she didn't dare to hope. But the police officer impatiently called her, and she got up slowly and painfully. Her body was still bruised from hanging onto the cliff. She followed him to the front desk, where she was handed her few belongings and told she could go. It had been decided that she was not going to be prosecuted for Jason Louis' death. She heard the word self-defense in the jargon they rattled off. But she was advised not to leave the country in case she was needed for further questions. Everything she heard and saw seemed far away, as if she was observing through glass. Did she have any questions? No. Well, did she have anyone she could come get her? They repeated the question impatiently more than once, and Jackie shook her head hard, trying to stir herself. I'll call my mother, she said dully. They allowed her to use the phone. Her cell phone had died, and she didn't have the charger. Was it in the car? She wasn't sure. Where was the car? Vaguely, she worried what might have happened to it if they had left her taxi on the side of the road. The car didn't belong to her. Mr. Furlong would not be pleased if it was damaged or stolen. She couldn't bring herself to be very afraid, though. She was numb. She called home first, and there was no answer. After thinking for a long time, she remembered her mother's cell phone number. Joanne was at work, but answered, though she wasn't supposed to. Her answers to Jackie were terse and cool. Jackie would have to wait an hour until she could get someone to come get her. Couldn't the police organize to send her home? Panic started to awaken in her again at the thought of waiting all that time under the eyes of the police, with them maneuvering around her in the tiny space, averting their eyes when she looked at them. The fear crept into her voice, and her mother impatiently said she would try to call someone they knew to come get her. Jackie sat waiting for a long time, clutching her personal items. People came and went, glancing at her, and she fancied they were thinking she had done terrible things. But she had, hadn't she? Suddenly she could hear Jason yelling again, and she recalled the sensation of striking out, and she thought she could feel and hear the crunch as the rock connected with his skull. The chaos in her mind threatened to drown her, and she got up abruptly, stumbling blindly outside into the tiny yard outside the police station. Outside, her stomach roiled. They had given her crackers and soda and cheese to eat. She had not touched them, and her empty stomach prevented her from vomiting there in the bare yard. She stumbled across the street to a tiny shop which sold a little of everything and asked for water. Her hand shook as she drank. The woman in white standing just outside stood looking at her and laughed. Jackie breathed the water into her lungs while the woman chuckled again as her body was racked with coughs. Jackie bent over, struggling to breathe, while her mind raced frantically. In the dismal fog which had plagued her mind since the events of the night before, her thoughts had skittered away from the image of the strange woman. That hadn't happened. It must have been a dream she'd had, which had invaded on her terror-filled memories. She was almost afraid to look, but when she did, the woman was still standing there, hands on her hips, her shoulders thrown back. It would be crazy to die now because of a little water after all you've been through, the woman remarked. She leaned closer and said softly, I didn't think you had it in you, Cher, especially when you refused my kind offer of help. Suddenly, the cutlass was in her hand. She tapped it idly against her thigh. What are you doing with that? Gasped Jackie. Someone will see. The woman shrugged and gave a narrow-eyed look at two boys passing them to walk into the shop. They glanced at Jackie with mischievous expressions, but didn't even look at her companion. Jackie flinched away from them, but neither seemed to notice. And when she looked back at the woman, the cutlass was gone, and she was looking thoughtfully back at her. Someone's coming to get you, yes? I'm sure it won't be for a while. Joanne has better things to do. We need to have a chat. Come here. In a moment, they were somewhere else. Jackie gasped, nearly screamed, and dropped to her knees, struggling against vertigo. Her hands touched cool grass. She closed her eyes, sealing herself for a moment before she slowly opened them, hoping that she was back in front of the shop. but the thick green grass was still under her hands. When she looked up, she was kneeling at the edge of a wide pool. Some ducks paddled across it, oblivious to the strangeness of what was happening to her. She was in a large clearing surrounded by tall trees, and for a moment Jackie thought she was alone. Behind her, a now familiar voice said impatiently, "Get up, girl." Jackie turned and nearly fell back at the sight of a large old house that filled most of the clearing. It was made of wood and raised up from the ground. 2 or 3 steps leading up to a gallery which took up a good portion of the front. The woman stood on the steps watching her hands on her hips. The cutlass now was sheathed, swinging from a loop on her belt. And Jackie stood up, turning her eyes away from her hard gaze. "I don't have time to deal with your fainting spells today," said the woman. "Listen to what I have to say and stand up straight." As Jackie complied, she said, "I'm Simone Bouvet. I am the leader of the sisterhood. This is where we gather when we need to confer. It's our place." "The sisterhood?" Jackie's voice rasped. She cleared her throat and tried to speak more firmly. "What does that mean?" "It means that you're among women who don't accept blows or money or arms from any man," said Simone. "All we need is ourselves. Once you killed your attacker, once you drew his blood, you fulfill the obligation for joining us." Jackie looked around and saw that she was no longer alone with Simone in the clearing. 6 or 7 other women had appeared without a sound and were standing or sitting, each on her own, watching them. They all wore white. Most of them wore dresses of different styles, even apparently from different eras. They all wore hats that shaded their faces. Jackie could partially see their expressions, but she couldn't tell what any of them were thinking. She looked anxiously back at Simone. I don't understand you." Simone gave an impatient sound, like a short, sharp shriek, her hand falling to the handle of her cutlass. Jackie started and shuddered, fear clutching her. She remembered her on that night, remembered the practiced way she had drawn the cutlass, and she knew that Simone had no qualms about using it. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Simone," said one of the women standing close to Jackie. One of the others behind them laughed out scandalously. The woman who spoke was wearing an old-fashioned dress covered in lace and fitted through her hips, splayed out in a mermaid train as if she was going to the races in My Fair Lady. She was so slender as to be almost unhealthily thin, but she held herself tall and elegantly, leaning on a parasol. Her face was hidden from Jackie by a wide-brimmed hat perched on the side of her head. Her voice was heavily accented, impatient, and bored. "How do you expect her to understand, Simone? Are you getting so old that you do not remember what a tizzy you were in when you first came here? What, 400 years ago? Fire on you." "Why, thank you for making me mind my ways, Renee," Simone sneered, but looked amused anyway. "I'm sure the likes of you would do well to learn from the likes of me would do well to learn from the likes of you." Renee turned gracefully toward Jackie. Beneath her hat, her hair was gathered into a small bun of curls. Her cheekbones were sharp in her pale face. Her eyes, as she looked at Jackie, were particularly unimpressed. "Have you ever heard of Les Jablesse girl, the devil women? Everyone has heard the stories. You've heard of the men who have been lured into the woods, their bodies found up to their necks in ants' nests, or mangled at the bottom of cliffs, or alive and wild-eyed, because then who would tell of us? Those tales are of us, madam. The stories are true. Tu comprends?" Jackie stared at her dark-rimmed eyes, struggling to comprehend. "Why am I here then?" she said at last, trying to distract them. Anything to deflect those accusing stares. Simone snorted impatiently. "You laid out that fool before he could get you, honey, that's why," said a curvaceous woman in a white pantsuit, who was suddenly at her shoulder. She was shorter and plumper than Jackie, but there was no way the girl could have worn the clinging outfit with the same easy confidence. This woman wore a white, wide-brimmed sun hat, deftly bent to cover one eye, and her makeup was flawless. Les Jablesse are the ones who kill the men who oppress them, the ones who fight back and win. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. This extract is taken from my novel in progress, The Daughters of Moko, which were inspired by the resurgence of the Mokojambi character in Trinidad in recent years. And it's based on the worship of the Orisha Moko, the god of fate and vengeance. Please excuse the voices. When the thing happened, Sonia had been on the cusp of her 21st birthday. She had felt the change almost as soon as the digital clock on her nightstand flicked to midnight, though if you had asked her then, she wouldn't have been able to say exactly what that change was. It had been more of an awareness of sorts, like a long sleeping presence had suddenly been awakened in her. At the time, she had been asleep and dreaming. At least she had thought she was dreaming, imagining herself standing in a dense thicket of forest, bounded by towering bamboo trees and dripping wet heliconia, their crimson cups overflowing with fresh rainwater. The recent deluge had left the red and yellow clay earth sticky beneath her sandaled feet, and she had breathed in the earthy dampness, feeling at peace in the forest's quiet, humid embrace. A loud blast had rung out in the distance, followed by another, yet another, forcing a family of macaws to burst out of the nearby trees in a flurry of blue and gold festooned wings, their loud, terrified squawks echoing through the canopy. She had hesitated, waiting, head cocked to the side, listening for a repeat blast or another sign of impending danger, but the forest answered with a heavy stillness, as if it too was holding its breath. Taking off through the trees, she had headed west in the direction of the sound, her narrow feet moving lethally over the squelching mud. Only when the colossal base of the great kapok that pinpointed the center of the valley had come into view did she reduce her pace, and as she neared the majestic tree, something buried deep within her unfurled and stretched, like a sapling, irresistibly pulled towards the pale sunlight that had filtered through the kapok's vast, sprawling crown. Her legs grew freakishly long, taking giant steps, at least 3 feet apart, and within seconds, they were ensconced by the tree's buttress roots, which rose from the earth like a monolithic winged creature awakened from its slumber. She had stretched higher, careful to avoid the large ropey vines that garlanded the immense trunk, the voices of the spirits moored inside, thrumming beneath her fingertips as they gasped the gnarled Asian bark, steadying her. She had looked around, slowly adapting to her new vantage point, her senses heightened, already attuned to the life teeming along the tree's thick uppermost branches, the soft chatter of monkeys as they crossed the valley using their skybound highway, and the sharp keening of tree frogs as they secreted their precious eggs in the glistening pools of water that collected in the bromeliads, which clung to the tree's limbs, grasping at the light. From there, she had an uninhibited view of the entire valley, with its fecund land, sleepy town, and thriving cocoa estates, nestled at the base of the verdant green peaks of the northern range. Piercing through the green, she zeroed in on the cause of the disturbance. A small group of men had gathered in the clearing, several yards away from her sanctuary, the stink of death and malice excreting from their pores like sweat mixed with unmetabolized liquor. Carefully, she had studied them. 2 were standing to one side, arguing heatedly. One was considerably larger and too overdressed for a trek through the bush. His opponent, way less dapper, with his oversized shirt and long, messy hair that hung like a frayed curtain around his narrow face. The third man, presumably the shooter, was still standing at the ready, rifle cocked steadily against his broad right shoulder and aimed towards the wall of trees. They hunted something or somebody, Sonia had thought, her blood running cold at the sight of the shooter's face, which was hard and tense like his body and pocked by a long scar, running from the crease of his left eye to the pursed line of his dark-tinted lips. He would have been handsome once, had it not been for the menace that flapped and furled around him like an invisible cloak, making her shiver. He took a small step forward as if sensing that they were being watched, but stopped abruptly and glared disgustedly at his boots, hurling a string of curses up at the trees. Sonia narrowed her eyes, searching for the cause of the shooter's vexation, and had caught sight of a fourth man lying still on the ground. Thick blood had coagulated around the gaping hole in his back and on the soil beneath him, which was strewn with crushed bamboo leaves and bursting ripe hog plums that burdened the air with a heavy, cloying smell. The sound of movement directly below her had momentarily drawn her attention from the men, and through the thick foliage, she spotted another man crouched low between the kapok's huge frontal wings. His chest was contracting viciously, while his blood-soaked hands had clutched his left side, where a wound blossomed like red hibiscus from his abdomen. His light brown skin was pale and cold with a combination of fear and blood loss. Sonia thought she knew this man, recognized him as the owner of a large plant farm just off the town's main junction, where her mother had been purchasing topsoil and seedlings since she and her sisters were old enough to walk. He had given them ripe mangoes and cherries whenever they were in season, and the triplets would often play catch or hide and seek with his own children amongst the well-ordered rows of saplings in the nursery. She had all but given up trying to recall his name when it came to her. Alan, yes, Alan Reyes. Everyone in the town and even the neighboring areas knew that if you wanted to go exploring in the bush, Alan Reyes was the man to take you in and bring you back in one piece. He would have been highly recommended to these strangers as a guide. She had signed resignedly. A part of her hoped that Mr. Reyes would make it home to his family. The other part of her, the secret part that had always been able to divine the future, knew it was more than likely that he would not. The gunman had gripped his rifle tighter, his breath quickening, finger poised to curl around the trigger. Manu, what the hell is this? What happening with you, boy? The question had come from the bigger and better dressed of Manu's two companions, their quarrel momentarily forgotten by his unusually restless behavior, but the shooter did not adjust his stance. It have something there, he answered gruffly. His black eyes focused on the single towering tree in the near distance, her tree. Dies a silk cotton, the third man with the greasy unkempt hair had piped in nervously. It have Jumbie living there. Ram, what chippiness you talking? The big man had sputtered, adjusting his hat so he could gaze up at the tree that hovered several meters above the canopy. It's 2019 and you still believe in them things? Sorry. Ram had shrugged, mumbling something barely intelligible about town people and them knowing nothing. We better don't take no chance, nah? I think we should just go from here, he had said, glancing expectantly from one man to the other. I telling you, I feeling like Jumbie watching we. The big man's face had crumpled with impatience. He flung his hat, and it landed squatly in the mud right next to the dead man's body. Pointing a thick index finger at Ram, he had begun to shout, spittle flying from his mouth like tiny bombs, decimating Ram's hopes of escaping the forest before nightfall. Well, I telling you, we stay in, and we're going to look for that man until we find him. Ram had averted his gaze, inadvertently missing the unspoken conversation that passed between the big man and Manu before he tried again. Boss, all I asking is how we going after he, when he was supposed to carry we. We could get turned around in there. I'm not going to lose up inside that bush, you know. At his last words, Manu had swiveled around and pointed the gun at Ram's scrawny ribcage. Like you wanted dead here today, he'd growled, face contorting into a mask of disgust as he regarded Ram's cowering demeanor. Their boss had remained silent, and after what had felt like a millennia to Ram, he ambled over to his hat and casually collected it from the ground, twisting it around in his hands for some time before finally turning to face them. All right, that's enough, he'd barked, and Manu had grudgingly lowered his weapon. Ram in turn had released a long, shuddering breath, his heart hammering within the cavity in his chest. He had briefly considered reaching for his own piece, tucked discreetly in the waist of his low-slung jeans, but knew that had he given him the slightest reason, Manu would not have hesitated to put a bullet squarely in his midsection and scatter his innards like rotten fruit on the sappy ground. Come, let's get this over with, the big man had ordered, staring at Ram impassively from beneath the shelter of his hooded eyes as he affixed the hat to his big, lumpy head. It'll be dark soon, and besides, he's shot. How far he could really get. They had followed his lead, Manu roughly nudging Ram with his weapon every few steps, reminding him of the deadly outcome should he put his mangy tail between his legs and try to run off through the maze of crabwood and hog plum trees. They had advanced slowly yet deliberately, their guns raised, eyes searching wildly as if half expecting something or someone to rush out of the bush and attack them. The end.
Decent? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Okay, so just to give you a bit of context, the protagonist of the story is Sammy. He's 11 years old and about to sit SEA, so already under a bit of pressure. Made slightly worse by the fact that he is the only child of the Prime Minister and a famous historian called Dr. Marcel Duncan. So they're a little busy and a lot distant. And this excerpt is about what happens one day that sends Sammy's life on a completely different trajectory. Sammy was buckled in between his parents on the back seat, stewing at having been dragged along to some ribbon-cutting event or other. Even revision was more fun than having to sit through endless speeches, especially with each speaker making a laborious point of mentioning anew the names of all the dignitaries in attendance. It was agonizing. And now, Sammy was being lectured by the Prime Minister about how lucky he was to be taken to meet such influential people, how he was squandering the opportunity to see firsthand how the world worked and how countries were run. He gritted his teeth and stared straight ahead, saying nothing. But just as the car was coming around a blind corner on Lady Young Road, rising just off the eastern savannah, Sammy spotted the dog. Going after a stick that had been thrown for, or perhaps at him, the scruffy creature darted out of the bushes. Yet, the mongrel's owner, if he had one, was nowhere in sight. "Stop!" Brakes screeched, a dull thud, and a whimper. Before anyone could prevent him, Sammy scrambled over the stunned Prime Minister and scooted out of the car. The accompanying Special Branch police officers hurtled out of their own vehicles, stopping traffic in both directions while chastising Sammy for creating a security risk. The dog had been clipped on his right hind leg, but was in need of help regardless, though his fluff did a commendable job of disguising his tambu-bamboo ribs. "Hey there, you," Sammy coaxed, inching towards him. The pounding pairs of heavy-duty police boots encircling him kept his voice steady. "Samuel Bedell Duncan, get back in this car this instant!" Whenever she called him by his government name, Sammy knew she wasn't fooling around. The terrier grabbed the stick and scampered, which was great because it suggested the blow wasn't serious. Not as great was that Sammy ignored the Prime Minister's command and sprinted after him, down the hill, darting in and out of oncoming traffic like a mad bull kite, dipping and ducking as if hundreds of zwills were poised to cut him down to size. Even with the hit to his hindquarter, the dog was fast. Born under a waning gibbous moon, Sammy was always wise beyond his years and naturally agile, but it took him some effort to keep up. He nearly tripped over the roots of the old saman tree in front of Jerningham Avenue, gnarled like witches' fingers cracking through the obsidian pitch of the savannah's running path. The dog took a sharp right and picked up pace on the drag, the track carved over decades of steel band racks being carted through the savannah to play at the annual Panorama Music Competition. Carnival, the festival of masquerade, magic, and madness, had recently come to an end, so the stage had been disassembled, offering a straight path towards the cemetery in the middle of the savannah. Hidden by a grey stone wall, not many people realize it's there, but it occurred to Sammy that if the dog decided to squeeze in through the rusty wrought iron gate, it would make a good hideout for both of them. A couple of the fittest police officers were still in hot pursuit. The others had given up long before the mongrel had hightailed it across the dusty trail. The Prime Minister's convoy was now circling the savannah, sirens blaring, haphazardly forcing motorcars out of its path like falling dominoes. The duo, however, couldn't be clearly spotted from the road, at least not yet. The strays suddenly made a turn towards the strip with the Magnificent Seven. Hovering around the water pumping station opposite Queen's Royal College, the country's oldest and arguably most prestigious secondary school, Dr. Marcel Duncan, PhD's alma mater and cause of the recent tension between him and Sammy, The dog seemed to be debating whether to bolt through traffic for the second time. Sammy cautiously approached, making a concerted effort not to be distracted by the splendor of the school's facade. "Listen, you," Sammy wheedled, crawling through the parched grass. It was well into the dry season, the heat was stifling, and the police were drawing closer by the minute. "I'm only trying to help. Can you just make this easy and let me?" They were both panting. The glint of the sun in the hound's eyes made it look like he winked before making a dash to his right. Sammy knew exactly where a thirsty stray would go and tried to cut him off at the pass, but he was too nimble. Sammy scurried after him towards the storm drain that, because of its comfortable size, occasionally attracted people with nowhere to go. He would often hear adults refer to these outcasts as vagrants or even pests, and always found it puzzling that in a country where his African ancestors suffered horrific abuses and his Indian ancestors had also been regarded as inferior, there was still an awful lot of folk being treated like they didn't belong. The section of the drain closest to the running path was open, but well shaded by the outstretched arms of adjacent pui trees. The rest ran underground in the bowels of the savanna, camouflaged by coarse, sapped sod. Fortuitously, which is how Sammy had discovered the drain in the first place, there was a standpipe guarding its mouth like a sentinel. For a kid who spent so much time exploring the savannah on sweltering days, it was an oasis. And for those who had no place to call their own, that secret standpipe was a beacon around which their unseen community could congregate, either to have drinks of water, bathe, or even wash clothes. The stray seemed to know where he was going all too well. One minute, Sammy had him in his sights. The next, he plopped out of view. Even for a dog his size, it would be a decent drop. Sammy slid into the gap just as the sirens came howling round the corner. The officers on foot, not noticing the drain, merely ran straight ahead. Sammy looked behind. No sign of the dog. He couldn't have slipped past him and headed back east. Looking for something? Sammy jumped. He turned around, expecting to see one of the standpipe regulars or a very cross constable. Instead, the most curious-looking individual stood before him. Only slightly taller than what he imagined hobbit height must be, the creature had a long, dark beard, liberally speckled with ivory, as if he'd played a fancy sailor at carnival and never got around to washing out the talcum powder. The beard itself was something to behold, thickly layered and labyrinthine, tightly hugging his face the way vines possessively wind their way around tree trunks. His long gray hair was neatly woven into dreadlocks that ascended into two distinct ridges on either side of his head, in the manner of horns. His eyes, the color of ore, looked muted compared to the rich copper of his skin, which had a wizened yet silky texture to it, like a slick coat of fur. Considering his age, Sammy was surprised at how strong he seemed. Maybe he was there to do maintenance work on the storm drain, but where were his tools? The only thing he carried in his right hand was a staff. It seemed to be made of wood, mahogany perhaps. There was a bold purple vein running through it, and bursts of what looked like green heart and the fiery yellow of African teak. Though the fibers were intimately entwined, Sammy couldn't detect any joints. The hook at the top was flat, angling sharply towards the spine of the stick before flaring out ever so slightly in the opposite direction. At its tip was a translucent fissured stone whose opulence belied the fellow's plain clothing, which amounted to nothing more than a soft burlap draped about his lower body like a dhoti, crossing his right shoulder toga style. "Well, Sammy Duncan?" he pressed. How does he know my name? Sammy wondered. And just as importantly, where's the dog? I'm looking for you, he blurted out, still scanning the footing for any sign of the mutt. It was the only name he could think of at such short notice, but it seemed to fit. "Well, you found me," the stranger replied. "No, you don't understand," Sammy clarified. "I've lost a dog." "And you've named it you?" "I suppose it does look a bit like a sheep." Sammy laughed, chiding himself for christening the dog with a pronoun. "No, Y-O-U. I'm afraid he might be hurt." "He's fine." "So you've seen him?" Sammy challenged. "You want him as your pet, do you?" the elder asked. "That's a serious responsibility. And this particular dog might be more than you can handle. Why should I trust you with him?" "Because," Sammy said defiantly, "I'll be a good friend to him, and..." Go on. His voice softened a little. I feel like I was meant to rescue this dog. Or maybe, he offered, this dog was meant to rescue you.
Good. Okay. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Bocas. I'm honored to be here. So, my story revolves around folklore beings, the characters that you grew up hearing about. They are real and they have revealed themselves to society. They want to be treated equally and without discrimination. In response to that, the government decides to create a ministry to help with this process. So there's the Ministry of Supernatural Affairs, and the main character is the Minister of Supernatural Affairs. So in this excerpt I'm about to read to you, the minister is supposed to get a message via a dream from a certain supernatural entity. Feet pounding on dirt, the blur of greenery, quick breaths. Aslal sped through the landscape, risking a glance backwards to see his pursuers, small brown creatures. They could have been duendes. He wasn't stopping to find out. Extra gasp as he tore up a hill, leaves crunching underfoot. At the top, he stumbled, rolling down in a cascade of undergrowth. Pain flared as Aslal's limbs tumbled over each other. Sharp leafy tips and twigs struck his arms and face. No time to stop. On flat ground, he scrambled up, running as he never had before. Panting, heart pumping, adrenaline flowing, growling noises behind. He was approaching a large oak tree. Should he climb it? But what if the Dwen things could climb too? Then, all the hairs on the back of Aslal's neck raised. A growl increased to a roar. At the oak tree, he heard a disembodied voice. "Duck, minister." Never slowing, he obeyed. As he ducked, a branch whipped over him and cracked against something. A strangled cry from one of the creatures. But there were more, cackling loudly, relentless with their pursuit. Aslal gave a terrified cry. He couldn't outrun them. He heard more instructions. "Go left." Aslal followed. Green and brown were the only constants in his vision. Moss and tree bark his only odors. Chest burning, ragged gasping, leaping instead of running. Leap to the right to avoid a trunk, leap left to dodge another, jump over a large root, dash through the gap between two trunks. The forest grew darker, mirroring Aslal's hope. The trees were closing in, forcing him to slow down. The more he continued, the more they pressed in until he was passing between trunks, madly pushing away branches. Endless scrapes from leaves and barks. The only sounds, his labored breaths, the whipping of branches. When Aslal squeezed through a particularly narrow gap, everything went black. He thought he had fainted. His heart lurched, but he found he could still move. He powered onwards. Then he burst into a large clearing. Gasping, he collapsed on the dirt. His aching body, disheveled clothes, and many cuts and scrapes didn't matter. Aslal was certain that he was safe. With each gulp of air, he felt more settled. Something was different. He went to the middle and rotated slowly, taking everything in. There were mango, pomerac, cocoa, plum, cheddar trees, and some bamboo. The glade had an ethery look from the setting sun. The air bore a sweet aroma, cloaking him in a comforting blanket. a light breeze ruffled the surrounding trees. Anticipation was ripe in the atmosphere. A strong wind swept across the area, causing the tree's branches to come together, forming a barrier of sorts. "Holy shit," Aslal whispered as he realized there was no wind. The trees themselves were shaking, branches clashing and interlocking. Between leafy breaks in the branch-like barriers, he took a step back. He was startled to see the Dwen things running around the clearing. Their laughs had changed to growls, crawling along his skin. They were attempting to claw through the joined branches, but somehow Aslal knew he would be protected in here. This was not supposed to happen. It was the same voice that had spoken when he had initially wound up in this dream space. The voice was being carried on the wind, resonating through him, resonating through the air and the trees. It was Papa Bois. "Minister Aslal Jahid, thank you for heeding Ram Singh's word and breaking the egg, allowing us to meet in this way. But it was not supposed to turn out like this." Aslal released a long sigh of relief. At last he would hear what the master of the forests had to say. He wasn't sure where to look or if to bow, salute, or make the peace sign. Focusing on some tall bamboo directly in his line of sight, he addressed this unseen being, hoping his voice wasn't shaking as much as his hands. "Papa Bois, it's a great honor to be in your presence. But what do you mean it wasn't supposed to be like this?" "Well, Minister, I brought you in this dream limbo to warn you of..." There was a drastic change in his tone. "Ah, them blasted shit creatures just bite me, damn bitches." Aslal heard the whipping sounds of flailing branches and multiple growls. It took him a moment to comprehend that Papa Bois had cried out because the Dwen things had bitten at the tree barrier. His jaw dropped in shock. He realized these were intruders in this dream space, intending to harm them both. Aslal swallowed, fervently hoping Papa Bois' power would be strong enough to protect them. The master of the forests returned. "Right, that should keep them quiet for a little while. Geez, Minister, this thing worse than I thought. I wanted to warn you and tell you that it have a force working against you. But this thing real serious. You ready? We don't have much time, but it's time to talk." Thank you.
So thank you, Vindhar. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Jolanda and Dixie-Ann. Please just give them another round of applause. We are very happy that you came here this afternoon and shared your work with us. So like I said, in a couple of years' time, when the books are published and you're queuing up to buy the books and get them signed, you'll be able to say, "I saw this, I heard this first at Bocas." So the next event in this space is going to start in 15 minutes exactly at 3 p.m. So you have a little bit of breathing time. I know the program today has been really packed, really back-to-back, but you've got a moment to decompress, take a little stroll. Our pop-up coffee shop is open until 3, so you have just enough time to go in there and get a coffee if that's what you want. We're going to be back here at 3 o'clock with RSA Garcia and Zalika Reed-Benter in conversation. And then that's not even the last event here in the fire station. Then we're going to be back here at 4 o'clock for one of our big ideas discussion panels, which has to do with the present and future of newspapers in Trinidad and Tobago. But like I said, it is a special pleasure for us here at the festival to have new writers, voices that are new to us, telling new kinds of stories. I mean, I shouldn't say this, but as much as we're happy to have world-famous writers here on stage, the most important, I think, part of what we do and the most fun part of what we do is finding new people, new stories, new voices, people telling stories that we don't even know we need to hear as yet, and having a chance to hear them for the first time on the Bocas stage. So thank you very much to these 4 writers. And we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.